Hannibal is at the gates. This is a phrase Roman mothers would say to their children to invoke fear. But who was the man that could make one of the most dominant empires to ever exist tremble with just the utterance of his name? The Lion of Carthage, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal is one of the most awe-inspiring figures from history, with mythology surrounding him from his very beginnings. He was raised with a fervor to follow his father's quest of bringing Rome to her knees following the unsatisfactory end of the First Punic War. It is this single-minded focus that will drive his legend from the Alps, through the fields of Cannae, and into every military tactician's education for millennia to come. The Carthaginian Empire was a Phoenician colony that is in modern Tunisia, located in North Africa. It was a merchant and trading special kind of place. It was very much focused on commerce and trading, and therefore was quite wealthy. It involved a small kind of citizenry, and so they actually relied on mercenaries for fighting their battles, which they were able to do because of that high wealth. The Carthaginian Empire, similar to Rome and the United States, was ruled by a senate, and it had its own constitution. They were elected by land-owning male citizens, so there was form of democracy, but of course that was not everyone was allowed to vote. And the Carthaginian Empire had actually gone to war before Hannibal got involved, called the First Punic War, and that had ended in a very sour way for a lot of the Carthaginians. There was a major naval defeat during that war, and that quickly led Carthage to sue for peace. As you can see in the Mediterranean basin, pretty much all water, so losing that navy was crippling. But then the war reparations that Rome demanded from Carthage due to that loss was untenable. It was an insane amount of money that was required. They also lost their claim in Sicily. And it was this war reparation that really created the divide rather, in Carthaginian politics. Carthaginian politics was really split into two camps. On one hand, you had the land party, which was led by Hanno II, and this really represented the merchants, those that were getting wealthy from the commercial empire that Carthage was building. And that is opposed to the Barcid party, who was led by Hamilcar Barca, which is Hannibal's father. And they were very much more interested in conquest. But it wasn't just for the sake of conquest. Hamilcar was specifically very unsatisfied with the result of the First Punic War, and he saw expansion as necessary in order to get out from underneath the crippling debt and reparations that Carthage had to pay to Rome. An incident that really changed the dynamics for Carthage and the future of the Mediterranean was something called the Mercenary War. Due to how crushing and overwhelming these war reparations were to Rome, Carthage was actually unable to pay its mercenaries, who subsequently rose up in arms against them. But it was during this war that Rome actually took Sardinia from Carthage. And so, from Hamilcar's perspective, not only will Carthage not be able to become anything, build anything, protect itself, because it has no money, but now Rome is adding insult to injury by stealing land from Carthage while it was distracted by that mercenary war. So this was a really big turning point for Carthage, as well as the Barcid family as a whole. Hamilcar will take this opportunity and take loyal soldiers, and his plan is to grow their holdings in Iberia and seize specifically the plethora of silver mines that are there, and really use the newly acquired wealth and riches to not only help pay Rome, but that allowed Carthage to allow it to use its money to help rebuild its military, help rebuild these different aspects that are not able to be addressed due to the overwhelming economic penalties. But before Hamilcar will go to Iberia, they will do a ceremony and sacrifice. Um, and Hamilcar will bring Hannibal, and there's a story that is told both by Polybius and Livy, who are both um, a Greek and a Roman historian, where they talk about how Hamilcar made Hannibal go through this thing and make an oath declaring to never to be a friend of Rome. And so this really shows that Hannibal and Rome's controversy, their battle, really comes from the very beginning of Hannibal's life. Hamilcar and the Carthaginians were highly successful in their campaigns in Iberia. They did very well, taking down tribes, taking in that wealth, and unfortunately in 221 BCE, Hamilcar would fall in battle, and that would leave Hasdrubal, Hannibal's older brother-in-law, in charge, but unfortunately later that year he would also die, which would leave Hannibal in charge and leading the Carthaginian troops in Iberia. Hannibal would continue the work of his father, gaining territory, amassing wealth from the Iberian Peninsula. But just like his father, he would be sending wealth but also troops back to Africa, which would help curry favor and help remind the Carthaginian Senate and government and make them feel comfortable that the actions of the Barcid family are for Carthage and it is not the Barcid family going separate. Because again, this was not a Carthaginian enterprise. This was the Barcid family getting loyal soldiers and taking it upon themselves to gain this wealth that will allow Carthage to survive these Roman war reparations from the First Punic War. Eventually, Hannibal would reach the city of Saguntum, which is in the top right of modern day Spain. And Saguntum was actually a Roman ally. And so when Hannibal came up to the city with his mighty army that has been absolutely conquering everyone in their path in the Iberian Peninsula there, it was a major line in the sand for Rome. Saguntum is our ally. Do not attack. Do not attack, or it will be open hostilities once again. This did little to sway Hannibal, as war with Rome, conflict with Rome, injuring Rome is the very essence of the Barcid mission. And so, despite knowing that this will lead to war with Rome, Hannibal would lay siege and subsequently attack and seize the city of Saguntum. As promised, with the attack on Saguntum, war was officially declared between Rome and Carthage. The map in the lower right shows the boundaries and the territories held at this point in 219 BCE. So you can see that large, huge swath of the Iberian Peninsula that has been seized. That is the work of the Barcid family. That it was begun by Hamilcar and continued by Hannibal. And this region here in Iberia would become to be known as New Carthage. So even if you may not know a whole lot about Hannibal Barca, you probably are familiar with the crossing of the Alps, him bringing elephants across the Alps. That is one of his resounding mythologies and resounding stories that echo through time. But what is really also important I wanted to highlight was from the Ebro River, which is located at where Saguntum is, to the Pyrenees Mountains, which kind of created a divide between Spain, France. Um, there was some major troop losses and difficulties in that stretch. And the graph on the lower left, it highlights just how damaging and how draining these campaigns were. After crossing the Ebro River and taking the city of Saguntum, Hannibal would go into four successive campaigns against local Celtic and Gallic tribes, and they proved to be extremely costly. And not only that, once he did conquer that territory and move forward, he actually had to leave soldiers behind to keep that territory. So not only were the losses incurred in battle, but then he had to leave 11,000 troops behind to protect that area. And what he did was he chose Iberian troops, those that were perhaps less loyal uh, and less invested into Hannibal's cause. So he really chose to take more of his African high quality troops across. But this is an important thing to point out is how costly that beginning part of the Second Punic Wars before any Roman and Carthaginian interaction, and even before the crossing of the Alps. As I casually mentioned in the last slide, elephants are a big part of the story of Hannibal. Carthage utilized war elephants to great effect. It was extremely, extremely invaluable in those early battles against the Celtic and Gallic tribes. However, elephants also create massive logistical difficulties, especially when we're considering crossing this massive European mountain range. That is not what elephants were made for, and there was great difficulty in not just getting them over physically, but maintaining the food, maintaining their health, and while elephants would be large, part of that initial army, with 37 beginning the journey, more than half of them would fall in the crossing of the Alps. As you can see in that left photo, there are numerous that are falling off, and that was unfortunately not a uncommon fate for some of these elephants. One of the most fascinating stories involving elephants and Hannibal is the crossing of the Rhone River. And the Rhone River is located in modern-day France, and it posed a huge problem for Hannibal as it's a super strong current river. But not only that, on the other side of the bank were thousands of Cavarus tribesmen who would not let the Carthaginians pass. And so Hannibal was really faced with a difficult situation here. And so what he did was he actually sent a contingent of troops 25 miles downstream all the way to flank behind the Cabarrus position. And meanwhile, the main army built these massive earthworks that are depicted in that left photo so that the elephants could cross this strong current river and still feel like they were walking on land. And they were able to coordinate to when the troops behind launched their attack and attacked the Cavarus encampment, and that allowed Hannibal to cross, and they were able to defeat the Cavarus tribesmen. But this just really shows the logistical difficulties of the elephants, but also the ingenuity of Hannibal and the Carthaginians here. This crossing of the Alps proved to be extremely costly. Of that 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry that Hannibal set off with, only 2,000 infantry made it and 6,000 cavalry. Of the 37 elephants that began the journey, less than half survived. A very small number survived, and most of those would not survive very long in this campaign either. Elephants would be largely phased out due to the Alps crossing in Hannibal's campaign against Rome. But these guys, these soldiers, they've been on campaign. They left Iberia 5 months before they were able to finish their crossing. And this Alps crossing was 15 days. So that's why it is important to highlight how extensive those earlier campaigns between the Ebro and the Pyrenees were for the Carthaginians. It took 4.5 months doing that. And then that brutal 15 days in the Alps. It wasn't just the cold, it wasn't just the lack of food, it was constant ambush from the Celtic tribesmen that really withered down not only morale, but obviously health, life, and supplies. In addition to the elephants, there was a lot of supply animals and pack animals that were lost. And this really creates a positive feedback loop because you don't have enough food to feed your pack animals, but then your pack animals cannot are carrying less food, which leaves less food overall. And that was something that Hannibal and his army really were struggling with during the crossing of the Alps. And it kind of seems like, okay, this was a bad call then by Hannibal. But in reality, there really was no other option. Since the end of the First Punic War, when Rome's navy crushed Carthaginian's navy, there was no equality in navy. Rome dominated the seas, and a Carthaginian invasion of the Italian mainland is not an option. Rome rules the seas. The only option was an overland route through the Alps. So extremely costly, but there would be no second Punic War if this happened. If the Alps did not happen, it would be Carthage is playing on the defense because Rome would be able to launch seaborne invasions. So that is something to keep in mind is yeah, extremely costly, but everything that follows was only made possible by a crossing of the Alps. And while Hannibal is crossing the Alps, Rome is preparing its answer. There are two consuls in the time of the Roman Republic that rule at one time, and they share the power. One consul took an army immediately and rushed up to meet Hannibal in the Po Valley, and his name was Publius Scipio. And in November 218 BCE, he would finally meet Hannibal Barca. What Hannibal will do is he will use his swift and very agile Numidian cavalry to help bait Publius Scipio, who is eager to confront this Carthaginian threat. And it works. He's able to pull his cavalry and pull his army out a little bit, and he's able to envelop and do serious damage. Publius Scipio is actually injured and would have died if not for his son by the same name, Publius Scipio. This battle is referred to as the Battle of the Ticinus. Scipio was definitely overzealous here, and following that engagement at Ticinus, Scipio fell back and awaited the arrival of Tiberius Sempronius, who was the other consul with him. And it was a very similar thing. Hannibal knew that these consuls would be eager to engage in battle, eager to crush this Carthaginian threat, and he was able to bait the Romans out of their camp yet again. And this was a brutal, brutal melee in which the elephants proved highly effective, and the the combined Roman army of both consuls were absolutely crushed by the Carthaginian envelopment. After a few months of licking the wounds, a new consul by the name of Flaminius attempted to head north to deal with the Celtic tribes that are now in open rebellion following Hannibal's absolute crushing at the Trebbia and at the Ticinus of Roman forces. So as Flaminius is hurriedly rushing up to go up there and quell this brewing chaos, Hannibal actually sets a beautiful ambush at Lake Trasimene. He sends soldiers up around an embankment, which is the second time that he has used a night march to coordinate an attack like he did at the Rhone River, which is extremely difficult. with no type of communication just really shows the level of trust and the level of tactics that the Carthaginians are using here. But at Trasimene, it is a complete bloodbath because there is nowhere for the Romans to go. It is a road with a lake on one side and a cliff on the other. And Carthage was everywhere the water wasn't. And 25,000 to 30,000 Romans died, including the Roman consul Flaminius, which is a huge blow to Rome. Following the three major Roman defeats at the Ticinus, at the Trebia, and at Lake Trasimene, Rome will prepare a new response. Under the Roman constitution, in times of great danger, of war, of great chaos, the Senate can elect to choose a singular person to lead the nation instead of the two consul system that has existed typically in the Roman Republic. And that dictator would have a term of a year, and it just allows, instead of two people trying to solve the problem, you just get one person in there. They can solve the problem, do their term, and then after the term, they relinquish power back to the Senate. And so the dictator that was elected in the summer of 217 BCE was Quintus Fabius Maximus. And he would be the correct choice, but he was very, very controversial by the tactics he used against Hannibal. So, from his perspective, Hannibal has now crushed the Romans 3 times. What can I do differently? Is he just going to build another army and make it number 4? No. Fabius Maximus employs a strategy of scorched earth, and this later would be known as the Fabian strategy. This is, you basically shadow the enemy army, but you do not engage. This is not about creating conflict. You are avoiding conflict. Instead of trying to take the enemy down through melee, you are trying to starve the enemy out. But here is the rub. In order for scorched earth and to starve the enemy out, you need to destroy the farms all over the Italian peninsula. You need to deny the enemy any chance of supply and food. But that also means now that the dictator, the person in charge of Rome, is now burning down Roman fields, Roman farmlands, destroying anything that Hannibal and his Carthaginian troops can use for themselves. This is a highly, highly controversial tactic back in Rome. Not only is Fabius Maximus not engaging Hannibal, which is seen as cowardly, but now he is damaging, burning down Roman land. And so this would be a very, very unpopular strategy back in Rome. Following the term of Quintus Fabius Maximus and his policy of pacifism, the Roman Senate was hungry for confrontation. They amassed the largest Roman army that had ever been created to that point, with 8 Roman legions and 8 allied legions supporting them. This led to a total of 80,000 Roman soldiers who were ready to face down the Carthaginian threat. But not only was it 80,000 men, both consuls, Paulus and Varro, 2 former consuls, and a majority of the Roman senators would be in company with this army. This was Rome's big answer. This was Rome throwing everything it has at the situation Hannibal has created. This is everything Rome can muster, and it is going to meet Hannibal at the fields of Cannae. The Battle of Cannae, perhaps one of the most infamous battles in all of Roman history. It began with Hannibal set in a crescent formation. He had his weakest troops in the middle. His weakest troops would be those of the Celtic mercenaries, those that have joined him, his Iberian troops, and then on the wings, he had his strong African Carthaginian troops. Those are the loyal guys. Those are the guys that you can count on to hold the line. And so, as the Romans, who showed up with this massive army, were ready to take on the troops in front of them, they marched straight at the Carthaginians. And as those weaker troops made contact, they started to just retreat a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And then, as you can see, as it transforms into that right photo, those troops on the wings, they don't move. They hold the line, and that middle begins to bend a little more, a little more, a little more. And then soon you have an entire envelopment of the 80,000 man Roman army. And Carthage's cavalry was king. Specifically, his Numidian cavalry were very fast, very agile, and absolutely crushed the Roman cavalry at every single interaction. And Cannae was no different, with the Roman crushing, or the cavalry crushing the Roman cavalry. It was an absolute slaughter. It was a slaughter of epic proportions. Men were dying, standing up. It was truly an hours long slaughter. The Battle of Cannae really transformed into something that it cannot be called a battle. It really was an absolute bloodbath because there was just a complete envelopment. And these guys, these Roman guys, just couldn't do anything. And so there actually was a small contingent that was able to push through that weak middle because Hannibal had really stretched out his line to help with this envelopment. He didn't have a bunch of reinforcements to back up in the rear. So there was actually the only guys that were able to survive were the ones that were able to punch through the middle. But Cannae cannot be understated how brutal and devastating of a defeat this was for Rome. The Roman losses were staggering. Of the 80,000 troops that marched to Cannae, 50,000 Romans lay dead. 50,000 men died in one place at one time. 10,000 more Romans were captured, with only the remaining being able to escape through the middle or the cavalry that were able to run away. This was a devastating loss. In addition to the soldier numbers, two former consuls died. One of the consuls, Paulus, died as well. A number of senators' sons died. This was a defeat of massive proportions. This was a defeat that would not be replicated in Rome's history for centuries to come. This was a slaughter. Now, this victory for Hannibal was resounding and miraculous. However, it did not come without cost. His men have been fighting brutally on the Italian peninsula for years, and they took major losses in that Cannae battle. Fortunately for Hannibal, a large portion of southern Italy actually split with Rome. A bunch of these Italian allies that helped make up the Italian peninsula actually switched allegiances to Carthage. And so this was huge and a complete transformation of the Second Punic War because now Hannibal had a place to rest. He had land of his own that is safe, that he's able to recuperate, that he's able to launch attacks from and retreat to. This was huge for him. But that also poses another thing. It is now a liability because he has the benefits of having land in Italy that is for him, but now he has to protect that land. Now there is somewhere for Rome to attack that isn't Hannibal's army. And so this really was a double-edged sword, and what really happened is it just led to a 12-year stalemate where Hannibal would launch excursions across, Rome's would generally just try to avoid conflict. It was a largely a return to the Fabian strategy, and for that 12-year period, no major battles occurred. Rome was unwilling after Cannae to lose more legions, to lose more men. And so this stalemate really persisted until 204 BCE. What happens in 204 BCE, you might be asking? 204 BCE is when Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus enters the scene. He is the son of Publius Scipio, who saved his father's life at the Ticidus. His father was the very first Roman to make contact with Hannibal Barca. So Scipio, recognizing that taking on Hannibal from on the Italian peninsula, army to army, is not working. And so what he does is he builds an army and he actually launches a seaborne invasion of Africa. And when he lands in Carthage territory, the Carthaginian Senate immediately call for Hannibal to return. And this was the one thing that got Hannibal to leave the Italian peninsula. Rome was never able to uproot Hannibal. It was Scipio threatening the city of Carthage itself that actually brought Hannibal off the Italian peninsula and back to Carthage. Now that Hannibal was back in Carthage, the battle between Scipio and Hannibal was destined and set. They would meet at Zama, and Hannibal would do some things differently in his formation that he did not do previously, such as lining up with his elephants in the very, very front, as well as this would be the first battle in which the Carthaginians have the inferior cavalry, and it has been Hannibal's cavalry that has been his ace up his sleeve, that he has been able to bait the Romans, to wipe out their cavalry. And it is in this situation that Scipio, after studying what had happened, made sure to bring the better, more superior cavalry. In addition to bringing better cavalry, Scipio knew he would have to deal with elephants while fighting in Africa. And so what he did was twofold. He set up his formations in alleys so that if and when the elephants charge, they can be funneled into these alleys that are created and subsequently cut down, thrown with spears, and basically give the elephants somewhere to run that isn't through your own men. Secondly, they used fear tactics. Elephants are very timid creatures, and there was a number tactics used by the Romans throughout their years fighting elephants. These include lighting pigs on fire and having the pigs run towards the enemy army screaming on fire. That terrifies the elephants. Novel sounds, so they would create sound wagons, would bang all these crazy noises to just confront the elephant with something it's never seen before and create fear. And the reason that you would want to do that is the exact thing that happened at the Battle of Zama. At the commencement of the battle, Scipio blared trumpets that terrified a large portion of these 80 elephants, who subsequently ran amok. But they did not run amok towards the Roman army. In fact, they turned towards their own army. These elephants, terrified by these trumpets, most of them turned around and trampled the Carthaginian army, scattered the cavalry, and created absolute chaos and devastation. Those elephants that did run forward were easily dealt with by those alleyways created by Scipio. Scipio Africanus had done what Hannibal did to everyone else. Hannibal would figure out the weaknesses and predict what that general would do. So he knew Flaminius would be in a hurry to get up north, and he sets up that ambush at Lake Trasimene. Scipio pays him back here by understanding Hannibal and knowing how to combat his strengths which were the cavalry and the elephants. The Carthaginian infantry and army was in disarray from this elephant chaos, and it led to an overwhelming Roman victory at the Battle of Zama in Africa. Following the defeat at the Battle of Zama in 204 BCE, Carthage would sue for peace and bring an end to the Second Punic War. Rome, after enduring 15 years of Hannibal and his men running wild on the Italian peninsula, slaughtering Roman soldiers, Roman men, Roman boys, left and right. The devastation that Rome incurred, both in terms of land, manpower, but also prestige. I mean, it had a large portion of the Italian peninsula rise up against it. This was an extremely, extremely damaging and draining war for the Romans. So you know that the reparations were going to be brutal, and they were. Carthage lost all overseas territory, meaning that now Carthage, all of that Iberian land that the Barcids had put together, that is all gone. Carthage is now only on the continent of Africa. In addition to that, they were made to pay 10,000 silver talents over a 50-year period, which is an astronomical amount. That is an unrealistic, insane amount of money that will absolutely cripple Carthage's ability to rebuild or do anything. And there was also military restrictions placed so that there was only a limited number of soldiers Carthage could have at one time. Its entire navy was surrendered. All elephants were surrendered to Rome. So now Carthage is sitting there with crushing debt, unable to barely even make these payments to Rome, and they can't have an army to protect themselves. So this leads to an absolute loss of sovereignty, loss of ability to defend themselves. So this would lead to a major decline in the Carthaginian Empire, um, and the Numidians from the west would slowly start chipping away at their land since Carthage is unable to defend it. So these war reparations at the end of the Second Punic War basically take Carthage out and not allow them to be a threat in the Mediterranean again. With the end of the Second Punic War, it also brought about the end of the legend of Hannibal. Hannibal would be able to serve in political office for a period of time until Rome begins to recover and then really starts to seek revenge for what had happened once it's strong enough. And it would be due to Roman pressure that actually Hannibal would be exiled from Carthage. And Hannibal would spend the rest of his days going to different courts, different empires, and trying to be an advisor. Uh, he was successful at the court of Antiochus III, who was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, and in fact he even led a small fleet against the Romans in the Roman-Seleucid War, but he was never able to quite make it stick due to the loss of the Seleucid Empire and the Romans. He would then go to Bithynia, where he would be in the military advisor role there, and that would be when the Romans caught up to him. The Romans have been pressuring him. He's been on the run, fighting against Rome this whole time. Even when Carthage has abandoned the fight, he joins the Seleucids in their fight against Rome. And at Bithynia, Rome catches up, and with the assassins closing in, Hannibal Barca takes his life in 183 BCE. The tactical brilliance and everything that it took to wage war in enemy territory for 15 years, to crush every army that they raised against you, to cross the Alps with elephants. It is no surprise that Hannibal has been an enduring figure throughout history. And while I can only scratch the surface in this short presentation about his feats and his prowess, one thing that really stuck to me is he made that vow He made that oath with his father at the altar to never be a friend of Rome. And he never did. He fought against Rome his whole life. Like I said, even once Carthage surrendered, he went and fought with the Seleucids against Rome. This was a man of fiery intensity who held his oath and never became a friend to Rome. Hannibal serves as an inspiration to both military leaders, but also people of all walks of life, including myself. It is a remarkable story of the Second Punic War. Thank you so much for listening.